Good morning and welcome to this symposium on the Candlelight Revolution and the prospect for peace on the Korean Peninsula. My name is John Owen. I chair the politics department here at the university. I'd like to begin by thanking you all for coming and thanking various sponsors of this event, the East Asia Center, the Pavilion Seminars Program, the Department of Physics, the UVA Korea Society, and the Department of Politics for support. And for organizing this event, Professor Dorothy Wong of the Department of Art, Professor Jae So of the International Christian University in Tokyo, and especially Seung-Hun Lee of the Physics Department here. From the latter part of 2016 through March 2017, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, underwent an extraordinary political change, which, as our symposium's title reflects, some call a revolution. A government exposed as being mired in corruption was removed from office by impeachment following peaceful protests by millions of citizens in a number of rallies in various cities, people bearing candles. Today, we're privileged to have a number of experts discuss this Candlelight Revolution and its ramifications for politics in South Korea and for the Korean Peninsula, that is, for relations between North and South Korea, and hence for geopolitics in Northeast Asia, and hence for the role of the United States in the region. Before we begin our first session, I'd like to recognize Stephen Mull, the university's new Vice Provost for Global Affairs. Mr. Mull spent 35 years in government service, most of that as a Foreign Service officer in the Department of State. Among his postings were as ambassador to Poland, as executive secretary, as senior advisor to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. And from 2015 to 2017, he was lead coordinator of the plan to constrain Iran's nuclear program. We are delighted to have Mr. Mull at UVA and delighted that he's here this morning to make a few remarks.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. Owen, for the invitation to be here today. It's such an important and timely subject to discuss. I also want to express my thanks to the organizers, including John Seung-Hun Lee and Jae So, for pulling such a terrific topic and conference together. I also want to recognize Meredith Wu, whom I haven't met yet personally, but is very warmly remembered here. Just in the few months I've been here, welcome back to Grounds. Dr. Wu, people are very pleased to have you here. And also want to send hello to the eminent South Korean scholar Baek Nak-chung, who is with us today, as well as my former colleague from the State Department, Philip Zelikow, who as counselor for Secretary Rice was really one of the finest strategic minds with whom I had the privilege to work during my career in the State Department, and we look forward to hearing Philip's analysis of the situation today. The events in South Korea over the past couple of years have been incredibly significant from a geopolitical point of view, but I fear that here in the West they have been seriously underreported over the years. And in an era where there's a lot of despair about the health of democracy, about the future of democracy, the people of South Korea, like the people of the Philippines a generation ago, showed as new democracies the power of people power in changing the destiny of a country. So it's been very exciting, inspirational, and instructive to watch how the Candlelight movement has unfolded over the past couple of years. Of course, it has a huge importance for the trajectory of South Korea's own internal political development, but it also has a huge geopolitical significance in that it has set the stage for addressing and, we hope, solving the nuclear crisis of North Korea that has bedeviled diplomats for more than a generation. In the West, we tend to look at this issue from a reality TV show perspective of Little Rocket Man versus the Dotard, their rhetorical war of words and their budding romance. But that really does not give enough attention to the significance of all of the issues that are at play in South Korea with North Korea in the wake of the Candlelight Revolution. Obviously, for South Korea, it's a lot more than about the nuclear question. It's about the security of borders, internal security, economic development, reunification of families, and so forth. For the United States, there are also huge questions that go beyond whether or not President Trump and Kim Jong-un are going to have another summit or not. Such questions as, if the conflict with North Korea comes to an end, what does that mean for the staying presence of the United States in the region? What does it mean for the balance of power among Russia, China, and the United States in northeastern Asia? What does it mean for the security of our treaty ally, Japan? And farther afield, what does it mean for nuclear nonproliferation policy, even as the United States is pulling out of a nuclear deal that, in fact, was working in Iran, and may be accepting another deal that perhaps isn't as effective or as definitive in limiting North Korea's nuclear potential. So all of these are hugely important questions that I look forward to learning the answers to from all of our gifted presenters today. So thank you very much. I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve Mull. We have two sessions today. The first is about to begin with three speakers. The second is a roundtable discussion. But chairing this first session is Dr. Meredith Wu, president of Sweetbriar College, author or editor of 7 books, including The Developmental State and Neoliberalism and Institutional Reform in East Asia. And as was already mentioned, former Dean of Arts and Sciences here at UVA from 2008 to 2014. It is so good to welcome her back. Meredith Wu.
Thank you, John. It's always nice to be back on the lawn, but above all, nice to be with you. I see so many students with bright eyes, full of curiosity, and obviously what happens in the Korean Peninsula is not only important for this country, but for your lives, for the rest of your lives, really. It's a very consequential thing that we're discussing here today. I also bring you greetings from Ambassador Yoon Jae Cho, who would have been here. He was desperate to come, except that there is the meeting of United Nations in New York, and so he had to be there. His son graduated with degrees in economics and art history from UVA, so he particularly wanted to be here. He also happens to be my brother-in-law, and I remember when he was appointed last year, I was really worried. I was worried looking at it from about a year ago that he might be coming to this country, quite possibly as the wartime ambassador, because it was a nervous-making time. So I'm gratified to say that compared to where we were about a year ago, certainly now we entertain the possibility that he might become, instead of a wartime ambassador at a really interesting, exciting time, maybe again providing some hope. I certainly feel in some ways, without feeling foolish, you've been fooled once, twice, 3 times, but I still feel a certain hope as I never felt since the year 2000. You know, I remember in the year 2000 that some kind of resolution with North Korea was this close, and that it was ours to lose, that resolution. And I certainly still remember like it was yesterday when Secretary of State Albright went to North Korea, and she was doing little dance, country dance with the little kindergarten kids in North Korea, and I really thought that we finally put an end to this needless war and needless problems in the Korean Peninsula. But hope springs eternal, and we'll discuss today what the prospects might be there, especially at the University of Virginia, you know, where we lost one of our own, Otto Warmbier, so needlessly, so tragically. You know, when I was coming here, a former student of mine said, well, ask the speakers why North Koreans murdered Otto. Well, we don't know the answer, but we certainly have every reason to have real curiosity about what happens. Well, I'm happy to be a moderator today. We have interesting collection of speakers. We have speakers whose expertise are molded through years of interesting experience, not just doing one thing, but many different things. That might be for Jae-jung, who started out as a physicist at University of Michigan, ended up being a political scientist, now teaching in Tokyo, Japan. And then we obviously have Phil Zelikow, my former colleague, who is a diplomat, scholar, lawyer, statesman, and a university administrator. I'm so happy to see you again, Phil. And then we have the keynote speaker, Professor Peng-na Chun. And, I grew up in South Korea. I grew up reading his books. I grew up watching his activism. Here is a person who is deeply committed to the agenda of democratization, who is very deeply a humanist. And when I see him, I remember what Rosa Luxemburg once said in terms of defining the term realism. She said, realism is the highest form of idealism. And that's how I always think about Professor Beck. And so I'm really happy here today that he will talk to us about a very interesting mobilization of, I suppose we call that civil society, with all the issues and problems the term implies. So he's going to talk about a particular kind of democratization that took place in Korea with massive mobilization of the so-called civil society as occurred in other places. But I suppose what's unusual about Korea as versus Eastern Europe or Latin America is the fact that it is a divided country, was a divided country, that there is some relationship, sometimes direct, sometimes not, between democratization and the prospect for peace and unification in that country. So the speakers will talk today about the relationship between issues like democratization and international security in Northeast Asia, try as best they can to connect the dots. Happy to be here, Professor Beck. Thank you. Yes, I think so.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and I thank the organizers and the university for inviting me. I'm also very happy to see so many young faces in the audience. I hope I can make your presence here, your time here worthwhile. After the meeting between our president, Moon Jae-in, and American President Donald Trump a few days ago, I thought I could perhaps begin this talk with the news of the day. But when I turned on the television, I could find nothing but Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey. So I'll just start with a more general remark about the situation. Well, I think it takes no expert, which I certainly am not, nor a recent visitor to North Korea, which I had the great fortune to be in the entourage of President Moon's visit to Pyongyang last week? Yeah. It takes no expert to observe that great changes are occurring in the Korean Peninsula. After 70 years of division and enmity, the two Koreas have entered an arguably irreversible course of reconciliation. In the wake of that process, the first ever U.S.-North Korea summit meeting took place last June, and the second one looms on the horizon. My argument is that South Korea's Candlelight Revolution, which began with massive nationwide demonstrations of 2016 to 17, provides the chief motor force, albeit not the only motor force, in this whole process. Thus, I shall first try to explain why and in what sense this Candlelight Revolution does add up to a revolution. The task entails an understanding of what I have termed the peninsula's division system, formed after the Korean War of 1950 to 53 ended in a stalemate, and that has persisted to this day. I shall next address the implications of this reality for South Korean democracy and inter-Korean relations, and the possibilities for change in South Korea, the entire peninsula, and the world system itself that are opened up through the weakening of this division system. Finally, I shall return to the current situation, including the question of denuclearization and the roles demanded of the major actors. So, first about the Candlelight Revolution. Although the term Candlelight Revolution by now has a wide currency in South Korea, relatively few people seriously weigh the point that the events so named diverge in many aspects from the textbook notion of revolution. And scholars who do address the point often come up more often than not with a negative verdict. For instance, the celebrators of the events point out how peaceful and orderly those demonstrations were, in spite of the huge size. It's estimated about 17 million people participated, a total of 17 million, and about 2.3 million on a single day at its peak. But the scholars, mostly social scientists, note precisely the fact that there was an absence of revolutionary or foundational revolutionary violence in this so-called Candlelight Revolution, and they note its reliance on existing constitutional and legal machinery to oust the old regime and bring in the new, and the resort to no obviously revolutionary measures by the new government, and so on. Hence, the Candlelight demonstrations, according on this view, the revolution and their aftermath should be characterized as a restoration and reactivation of the existing constitutional order rather than a genuine revolution. Now that's all reasonable and sensible according to the textbook notions. But I think what's ignored in this analysis is that Korea is a divided country, and also a divided country of a very peculiar nature. That is, it has what I've called a sui generis division system, which has persisted since the end of the Korean War. And in terms of domestic politics, it has sort of suspended the full activation of the relatively democratic constitutions that we have had. So, and I've called this the hidden constitution, or the versal clause in the Constitution, delimiting the rule of law and the and the efficacy of the written Constitution. What the Candlelight Revolution accomplished was not a reactivation, but activation for the first time of the democratic constitution of the 1987 regime. Because in June 1987, there was another very powerful uprising that ended dictatorship in South Korea. So we've had we wrote a pretty democratic constitution at the time, but it was never fully activated because of what I call the hidden clause or the hidden constitution. So the change this time essentially meant a change from a country where the constitution is not observed to one where it is being observed. So that's really a more revolutionary event than any violent overthrow of a particular government. Also, because of the division, the consequences of this change in the regime will bring, and I think is bringing, a revolutionary transformation of the whole peninsula. So that too qualifies the Candlelight events as a revolutionary one. Now, here I would like to make two further points about the Candlelight Revolution. One is that the Candlelight Revolution from 2015 on represents an advance on the previous civic revolution of the 1987, the one that I just mentioned, thus representing a different order of achievement from the overthrow, peaceful or otherwise, of a repressive regime for the first time. So I think we should recognize and give credit to all the many peaceful uprisings that have brought about change in the government. But also we should differentiate between those events that accomplish this for the first time and that are often followed by backlash or reversals, as we see in, say, in Egypt or in many countries, and the South Korean Candlelight Revolution, which sort of stood on the shoulders of previous achievement. So I think that also makes for a very special status for this revolution. Secondly, this achievement needs also to be seen in the global context of classic revolutions proving increasingly difficult to come by. While violent suppression of popular uprisings becomes increasingly burdensome even to dictatorial regimes on account of general advance in human rights consciousness and the technological developments facilitating communication and dissemination of information across national borders. I better use my reading glasses. So, I think those scholars who insist on the so-called classical model, such as the French Revolution in the 18th century, or the Russian Revolution in the 20th century, early 20th century, are likely to run out of new subjects if they stick to that orthodox line. Even the Chinese or Vietnamese revolutions, which are supposed to be communist revolutions, succeeded, I think, in large part because they were also wars of national liberation, and which is another reason why they have survived when Soviet and the East European communist regimes collapsed. So, well, so much for the notion of Candlelight Revolution. Now I'll come to South Korean democracy. Dictatorships in both North and South were major pillars of what I call the division system, together with the Cold War and US hegemony in the world system. When in 1987, democratization began in the South and the East-West Cold War ended soon after, the division system went into a stage of crisis and has never recovered its old stability. In the past decade, the tension was much heightened in the Korean Peninsula, and some believe this was a restoration of the division system. But I've always argued that it signified a more unstable and extremely dangerous, increasingly dangerous phase of the division system in crisis. Now, I've said the division system went into crisis in 1987, but the South Korean political regime that emerged from this in the democratization process, and we also call this the 1987 regime. The 1987 regime shook the division system, but never really abolished it. That's why we've had so many vacillations and vicissitudes of South Korea's progress in democracy, which was largely interrupted and even reversed under the past two administrations, under Presidents Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. It was in keeping with the nature of the division system that retreat in democracy, domestic democracy, and deterioration of inter-Korean relations turned out mutually reinforcing. And it is this sort of vicious cycle that was stopped by the Candlelight citizens. It's true that reconciliation with North Korea was not among the most salient issues in the Candlelight demonstrations. But peace, as well as justice and fairness, did represent the fervent wishes of the crowd, and by decisively weakening, though not yet finally abrogating, the hidden constitution, the Candlelight citizens opened the way for the overcoming of the division system. Now, finally, I'll address the changes in the peninsula. It is my conviction that after the Panmunjom declaration by Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un in April 2018, this year, the June 12 U.S.-North Korea summit in Singapore, and the September Pyongyang declaration at the third and latest summit meeting between the two Korean leaders, movement for peace in the Korean Peninsula has acquired an irresistible momentum. Now, I know this is not a view shared by much of the mainstream press or the pundit opinion in the United States. They focus sometimes exclusively on North Korea's denuclearization and generally express skepticism regarding Kim Jong-un's willingness to implement his promises. In South Korea, too, a number of desperate opposition politicians eagerly join in the skepticism, despite more than 80% approval rating for the Pyongyang Declaration among South Korean people, and despite even the American president's favorable response. But in my opinion, such negative views misunderstand North Korea's national goal. I think Professor J.J. Seo will have more to say on this national goal. They also misrepresent the contents of the declaration and misgauge the momentum for peace and reconciliation already in operation. Now, the momentum is so powerful because its prime motor, as I said at the outset, derives from South Korea's ongoing Candlelight Revolution. Recent developments demonstrate that for all the eagerness of President Trump's for dramatic accomplishment, and the decision by Chairman Kim and his regime to focus on economic development at the expense of its nuclear capability there is not enough leverage either in the US or North Korea to bring off a mutually acceptable deal. In other words, if just left to themselves, to the two leaders and two parties, the solution will not come. What they need is the further input of South Korea's mediation and its proactive measures for inter-Korean reconciliation. Actually, building a closer and institutionalized political arrangement between the two Koreas. That is not necessarily unification, but something closer than just peaceful, something more than just peaceful coexistence between them is absolutely necessary, even to realize the denuclearization of North Korea and the whole Korean peninsula. Well, you know the famous phrase CVID, complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. The North Koreans rejected this term, and the US modified the phrase to FFVD, that is, full, finally verified denuclearization. But in either case, this will not occur without corresponding guarantees for North Korea's security. And that was the agreement between the two, Trump and Kim at Singapore. But I think for sufficient guarantees, security guarantees, you not only need what US has to do, for instance, declaration of the end of war, the peace agreements among the belligerent parties in the Korean War and so on. Those, I don't think, will be quite enough of guarantees, because Donald Trump has already torn up the agreement with Iran, and I think less erratic presidents of the United States in the past have also gone back on their previous international agreements. So, in order to make quite sure that the US, after signing the peace agreement and even peace treaty with North Korea, to make sure that the United States will not return to a hostile policy toward North Korea, I think you need an additional guarantee. I mean, I don't mean just supporting guarantees by China, Russia, and so on, but a kind of a loose union of the two Korean states, which I like to call the Association of Korean States. And in that case, North Korea will be a partner, associated partner of the US ally South Korea. And it will be much more difficult for the United States to reverse its course, to attack North Korea, or to carry out otherwise active hostile policies. And there is another aspect, another problem in the security guarantees demanded by North Korea. They don't say this explicitly now, partly because of pride, and partly because the relations with the U.S. are the primary target at the moment. But I think even after U.S.-North Korean relations are normalized, the very presence of South Korea will continue to pose a threat to North Korea. So you have to work out some kind of an institutional device to mutually guarantee the other's continuation and existence, and also to open the way for active cooperation and collaboration between the two Koreas. And so I'm not saying that the establishment of an association of Korean states is a prerequisite to the solution of the nuclear problems. But what I am saying is that the process of building such an association and the process of providing guarantees and obtaining denuclearization measures should go in tandem. And I don't think you can just obtain denuclearization by the U.S., even if the United States grants all kinds of promises and treaty guarantees. Now, such a situation where the Candlelight Revolution is so important in building a peace regime in the peninsula and in the solution of the immediate North Korean nuclear problem. Such a situation in turn indicates that President Moon needs to sustain popular support within South Korea. He currently has something like approval rating of some 60%, a little over 60%. It had fallen as far as the low 50s, which is not very low by American standards, but considering that he had enjoyed 70 or 80% approval rating for about a year, he had reached a pretty low point. Now, I think 60% is a pretty decent figure, but also it's the necessary level of support to for him to continue to play the role required of him in the international arena and in the inter-Korean relations. Now, President Moon needs to sustain popular support within South Korea, where, as in most democracies, bread and butter issues play a prominent role among the electorate. Some supporters of inter-Korean reconciliation fear that the process may be derailed precisely by the government's failures on the domestic front. And I share that concern. But again, I submit that under the division system, one should always see the domestic and inter-Korean fronts as essentially a single one. The opening to the north will in time bring economic dividends to the south, and progress in domestic reform will ensure that those dividends will not be monopolized by the already super rich. And in fact, more expert management of the economy will be needed, I think. But again, I think it's important that civil society should intervene to place the economic issues in their proper context. If you reduce those issues to one of to a question of proper technical management, you will lose sight of the fact that those problems are part of all the accumulated problems of Korean society and of the Korean Peninsula. So I think what the civil society can do is that they can go out and give expert guidance to the officials and so on, but they should be able to sustain the right framework for the economic debate. Now, the drastic weakening and eventual dismantling of Korea's division system will further diminish America's global hegemony. As Bruce Cummings has maintained over the years, the Korean War was a more important war than Vietnam because it turned the United States into a country able and committed to conduct the Cold War. The final end of Cold War confrontation in the Korean Peninsula will therefore signify a correspondingly serious blow to the whole system, much larger than America's defeat in the Vietnam War. So the Trump's critics may thus find another instance of his irresponsibility and errancy in his rapprochement with North Korea. I shall eschew a judgment on his personal qualities, but I would remark that his positive role in the Korean question seems quite in keeping with his destructive work on many of the multilateral mechanisms for U.S. hegemony that the American elite worked so hard for more than a half century to build and sustain. Those mechanisms, though still bringing munificent rewards for the elite, is neither sustainable for the long run nor beneficial in the short run to ordinary Americans. Thus, what looks like he's selling America's birthright for a mess of pottage may in fact have a deeper sense. He represents, however misguidedly, the legitimate rage of the American people at a global order that has become unsustainable and inimical to even to the country's own ordinary citizens. And to tell the truth, domination and exploitation of the world isn't anybody's birthright either. Thank you.
So I'm going to approach my presentation a little differently than Professor Peck. I'm going to offer a few observations about the general situation, offer a few comments about how one might try to solve this problem, and then actually open the floor for a few minutes to any of you who want to ask me questions about my views. There'll be another opportunity to have an interchange with the audience during the panel discussion after Jae Cho gives his little talk after mine. So a few initial observations. I'm not an expert on Korea. I try to be an intelligent consumer of the expertise of others. I have the only reason probably I should even be involved in discussing these issues is because I've worked on these issues from time to time for my government and as an outsider for about 25 years, along with many other things. My perspectives on these things are the perspectives of the United States and a global perspective. When I've worked on plans for a war against North Korea. I've worked on diplomacy to try to solve problems with North Korea. I've done both of these things inside the government, in Track 2 dialogues with the North Koreans, and also as a private citizen. And having done this for a very long time, among many other problems that have crossed my desk, I have some perspectives perhaps on how to try to solve this problem from an American point of view. But I want to stress the American point of view. American interests here are not the same as South Korean interests. To give you an example, South Koreans have long had to resign themselves to the fact that North Korea can destroy much of their country and kill a great many of their people. That's been something that North Korea has had the ability to do to South Korea for a very long time. And the South Korean people have become used to living under that shadow. The American people, on the other hand, have not become resigned to the fact or the possibility that North Korea might have the ability to kill large numbers of Americans, devastate parts of the United States, and threaten the United States that it could do those things. The United States has not accepted that this should be so. It has not resigned itself to the inevitability of such a danger, and it has thought very hard about how to prevent such a scenario. It turns out when the United States thinks about how to prevent such a scenario, most of the ways the United States would prevent this militarily do not come at cost to Americans, they come mainly at cost to Koreans. So if we don't want to live under that shadow, the things that we would have to do actively to stop it would mostly come at the cost of Koreans. So there are obviously some points of tension here and different perspectives. The United States also has regional responsibilities that extend beyond Korea and take very much into account the concerns of countries like, say, Japan, but also the situation of China and others, including Russia. The United States also has global concerns that it tries to balance about its position on the proliferation of nuclear weapons and mass destruction and so on. So I'm just simply saying it's a different set of points of view that have to be reconciled, different perspectives. So that's my first observation, is just that I come at this with a distinctive American and global perspective. Second opening observation. Oh, and one more point, too, there about the global perspective one has about what Professor Paik referred to as a division system. I'm perfectly ready to accept that there is a division system in Korea. I've worked in my career on a number of different division systems in different parts of the world. I know a little bit about the Korean division system. I know a lot about the one that was in Germany for 45 years and directly participated in the diplomacy to unify Germany in 1990. And that was a division system actually that worked very differently. It actually tended to strengthen West German democracy and underscore West German democratic values rather than cultivating a West German dictatorship. This occurred, by the way, in a country, Germany, that actually was much more militarized than Korea is today, and was actually a much more dangerous situation in many respects during the 45 years of German division. There are other division situations in other countries around the world, but I only mention this because it's, again, useful to have a global perspective on a variety of possibilities and ways that you try to overcome divisions when you see different ways that have been tried or failed, both in Korea and elsewhere. Second opening observation, and this is an observation about image and reality. I agree with Professor Paik and with President Wu that there was a serious danger of war in 2017 that has now significantly reduced. Actually, it's not, I think the danger of war, when I worked on these issues in the early 1990s, in 1993 and 1984, the danger of war was actually greater then than it was in 2017. I know that firsthand because I was involved in the very secret war planning for that war. And although the ability of North Korea to damage South Korea in such a war was lower then than it is now. So there have been a variety. It was, however, I think, a very dangerous situation. And so an interesting question of image versus reality is that danger seems to have gone down. Why? In my view, for instance, it has very little to do with any of the summit diplomacy that you saw in 2018. For reasons that I actually believe outsiders do not understand well, I've heard a number of experts, including South Korean experts, make their arguments about trends in North Korean decisions. For reasons that are North Korean reasons, the North Koreans appear to have decided around the end of 2017 and into early 2018 that they were going to proceed with a massive public shift, which they had the current leader had telegraphed in speeches going back years before that as a possibility, that they were going to make a fundamental shift from sort of a defense sufficiency priority to an economic renewal priority. As I say, he had indicated perhaps that first we're going to get in the defense place we want, and then we're going to move to economic renewal maybe years ago. There's a theory that this is actually the unfolding of a long gestating plan that goes back to 2013 or 2014. Not sure. But clearly the decisions to actually make that shift internally in North Korea were made around, in late 2017, early 2018, for reasons we don't know. Now, you'll notice that that's before any of these summits and before any of the noisy public diplomacy. The reasons for that may have to do with the the rising danger of a conflict, the new waves of sanctions placed upon North Korea, and very private and important conversations between the Chinese leadership and the North Korean leadership. I don't know. Or just the unfolding of his previous plan. My only point is that the image of the public diplomacy, which dominates the narrative, actually has relatively little to do with why the danger of war has actually eroded, in my judgment. And by the way, therefore, if we don't understand the reasons fully why it eroded, we're not sure what could bring it back again. And it has to do with calculations about which we outside of North Korea should be humble about how much we understand them. So I believe, therefore, that the focus, therefore, has to be on how you preserve this peaceful situation and then slowly build on that. That brings me to my third observation, which has to do with concrete problem solving. Most of the politics surrounding Korea has to do with arguments about culture, not problem solving. This is a kind of an elemental point, but I think it's important to understand. Most politics is about culture, not about how to actually solve real problems. Most of the divides in Korea, between the two Koreas, you could argue, but especially inside South Korea, are cultural divides. They're really quite, as I observe it, South Korea has been, for many years, a profoundly divided society. The divisions run very deep, And they are not kind of arguments about, technocratic arguments about how to solve this or that problem. They are profound arguments that have to do with attitudes towards Korean identity, what it means to be Korean. They have to do with attitudes towards Japan and Korea's whole history and legacies with Japan, which often turns out correlate strongly with attitudes towards America and attitudes towards Americans and its role, which also correlates strongly with a cultural argument about war culture versus peace culture, and a binary in which are we a culture that prioritizes martial readiness or a culture that prioritizes peaceful cooperation. Again, these are almost have to do with issues of culture and temperament, and these cultural divides are actually really quite generational, and you can see them inside Korean families when you talk to, and if some of you are from South Korea, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you know exactly how these arguments play out in your own family, perhaps. So I come back to my observation. Very little of this is actually about the technical issues of how I actually solve any of the concrete problems in the Korean Peninsula. Now, this is magnified in the U.S. government to a significant degree. If I was, let me just offer this schematic diagram. If you were to ask, in the U.S. government, how many people work on trying to understand and describe the Korean problem versus how many people actually work on how to solve the problem, I would say the ratio is there are 10 people who work on studying the problem for every person who works on how to solve the problem. At least a 10-to-1 ratio. I don't actually think that's hyperbole. All right, so if I have a 10-to-1 ratio of people who basically work on admiring the problem versus the people who work on solving the problem. Then now we go into the 10% that work on problem solving. In the 10% that do the problem solving, I'll make a further statement, conjecture, that there are 10 people who are working on how to solve that problem militarily for every person that works on how to solve this problem diplomatically in the United States government. Now, there are understandable reasons for these ratios. I actually don't think these ratios are hyperbole. In fact, I may even be understating the case. If someone could actually crunch these numbers, which they can't. But this is my observation of the sociology of my own government. Now, when you come back to this, man, there are probably then, if you're right, Zelikow, there are really very few people who study how to solve the Korean problem, say, with diplomacy. Yeah, I bet I could count them on the fingers of one hand in the United States government. That is, people who have seriously thought about this with serious diplomatic experience, as opposed with experience as an intelligence analyst examining North Korea, which is actually the background of a lot of the commentary and people who you hear from. It just turns out that my particular interest in all of this in recent years has actually been on diplomatic problem solving, and so I'll sketch briefly how I think one might go about the diplomatic problem solving and just outline a few ideas and then stop. In the diplomatic problem solving, my first point for you to consider, my three observations were U.S. and global perspective, image and reality, problem admiring versus problem solving, and just kind of the sociology of that. So now, problem solving. How would we think about going about this? First point, there is no visible diplomatic strategy right now for how to actually solve any of these problems that I can make out. Summits are not a diplomatic strategy. They can be part of a diplomatic strategy. Mostly this current round of summits, which are primarily orchestrated by the South Korean government, not by the United States, and have been from the start, rather brilliantly, I think, actually, by the South Korean government, has been designed to create a sense of cultural and domestic political momentum around a peace culture. I get that, and I think they've orchestrated this brilliantly. By the way, they've also done a brilliant job in managing President Trump personally, in figuring out how to kind of manage a very strange and eccentric American personality with depth and sensitivity to his nature, including in the way they've managed the trade issues and the current trade agreement in which they've given the Americans the cosmetic appearance of a new U.S.-South Korean trade agreement that actually has almost no substance in it whatsoever. But the Americans needed the cosmetic appearance of something, and let's give them the cosmetic appearance of something that doesn't actually create too many new problems. So, first point then, no visible diplomatic strategy. The diplomatic work, as I read it right now, is profoundly disorganized, ad hoc, and focused on temporary images to serve domestic political audiences, by the way, in all three key countries. That's fine. I think that's going to basically tap out as far as the marginal value it can add if it has not tapped out already. And so, for instance, I think the rush now to have another summit and to get that organized soon actually is beginning to, may actually go a summit too far and begin to actually make it harder to solve these problems and could produce a blowback. But again, the South Koreans are playing a key role in orchestrating all of this. So that's my first point, no visible current diplomatic strategy, it's ad hoc. Second point, if you were to think about basic kinds of diplomatic strategies to Korea, there's one strategy that's a kind of a multilateral coalition approach, and the strategy we have now that I will call it's a triangle of relationships. So what you have basically are a triangle. The core of this diplomacy is a triangle of bilaterals. It's South Korea, North Korea is one line in the triangle. South Korea, United States is another line of the triangle. United States, North Korea is the third line of the triangle. And so you've kind of got, and so in theory, if you were the United States, you would actually try to balance the different parts of these all these things so it all worked. By the way, this is a pattern, this triangular diplomacy, that the North Koreans like very much, because the North Koreans want, above all, to be seen as a peer of the United States of America. And they also want the South Koreans to be kept kind of in their place a little bit. If you instead had a coalition approach in which the South Koreans and the Americans were working in tandem, with the Americans backing the South Koreans, but with them working as a team, in which the South Koreans are reinforced by the United States, but the South Koreans are in the lead, that actually escalates the place of South Koreans as the appropriate partners of North Korea in discussing the future of Korea. It de-emphasizes the role of the United States in certain important ways, and actually, I believe, would be in America's interest. Interestingly, though, I actually don't think it's in America's interest to elevate and make ourselves central in diplomacy with North Korea, unless we have to. There are certain issues where we're indispensable, especially the nuclear ones, because we know a lot more about nuclear weapons, thank God, than South Korea does, though that was touch and go in the 1980s. Another point I'd make, part of this, just to help generally see the strategic choice, I'll call this the choice between the one-lane road and the multi-lane highway. Our current diplomatic strategy, and for a long time, has been the strategy of the one-lane road, which is called denuclearization. So let's say, here's what I mean by a one-lane road. There are a lot of issues with North Korea, lots of issues. Okay? But what you say is that, yeah, but every one of them lines up behind denuclearization. So we want to talk about peace regimes or economic cooperation or human rights or whatever we want to talk about. All those things line up behind denuclearization, get in line in the one-lane road, on the narrow bridge. And so if nothing can progress, you see, unless the lead car on denuclearization can progress. Then when you work on the denuclearization problem for a little while, you'll realize that denuclearization itself is a super hard problem. And in the best case, where the North Koreans really want to work with us on this, to actually accomplish denuclearization 10-year process. There actually are people who've done very hard work on how this would actually unfold. And 10-year process, and very complex, involving a lot of money, a lot of inspectors, a lot of economic assistance. Okay? So, therefore, necessarily, the denuclearization discussions almost always turn into step by step. So therefore, to make denuclearization process, since you can't do this in one swoop, you say, all right, you North Korea, you'll do this one initial step, and we, the Americans, will do this one little initial step. And then they always take an initial step that we think is never enough or is wrong. And then we take an initial step that the North Koreans think is kind of never enough and isn't properly implemented either. And actually, the result is that it makes things worse, and the diplomacy gets even harder. And we're right in that process again. So, for instance, suppose the North Koreans, for instance, under pressure to do a November summit, say, well, we're going to make some sort of declaration about what an initial step of declaring what we've got. The odds that that declaration will satisfy the United States and be regarded by our intelligence community as accurate, I believe, are low. But, who knows? And then you can just immediately see how you then get in a really quite toxic discussion about the quality of their declaration, because remember, our initial step in return for that isn't going to be to eliminate sanctions. It'll be to do some little thing that we can present as being, a token of good faith. You see the problem. So the alternative diplomatic strategy, in my view, is the multi-lane highway, which basically says, what are all the issues we've got here? We've got issues, for instance, on how do we define the nature of relations between the two Koreas in the future? You know right now that informally these two countries don't recognize that the other exists. They don't have diplomatic relations. They don't have embassies, because they actually haven't formally agreed that there should be two separate states ultimately. They don't have a border. They have an armistice line and a demilitarized zone out of a ceasefire agreement. They don't have a border. I mean, just basic stuff. So, what's the political relations between these Korean states? What should that be? What about the nuclear issue? That's another track. By the way, what about all the other security issues? And, the UN sanctions, of course, have a lot to do with ballistic missiles. How about all the chemical weapons and nerve gas stockpiles in North Korea? Do we care about that? Yeah. How about the conventional forces, the million people massed? Yeah, we care about that too. So you got to discuss that at some point. What about economic relations and the UN sanctions? Got to talk about that. What about humanitarian issues, whether it's family reunification or you want to call it human rights? Have to at least be willing to discuss it, so that's a track you discuss. Oh, and regional concerns. Don't we have to pay some attention somehow to what the Chinese and Japanese? Yes. So a lot of things. My view is rather than put them all in order and stack them up behind the denuclearization car, actually, I think Professor Paik and I would agree. He used the word in tandem. I actually have advocated publicly, let's do a multi-track negotiation, have a 6-lane highway in which, hey, let's talk about everything we want to talk about. We're going to have a process in which all those things are on the table. You raise anything you want, we'll raise anything we want, let's go. And each of those tracks have different participation. Some of those are just between the two Koreas, some of them involve 4 countries, maybe one of the tracks on the regional stuff involves 6 countries. Maybe, actually I think better 4, because I don't want either Japan or Russia. I'd be happy to have Japan, but then I'd have to take Russia. And in any case, I think that should wait a little bit. But, let's talk about it all. Question, gee, wouldn't that be too hard? How can you do all these tracks of diplomacy at once? Answer, back in the days when we used to do diplomacy, we did this sort of thing all the time. When I was involved in the stuff on Germany, we were negotiating on Cold War issues with the Russians on at least 11 different tracks simultaneously. I won't go into the detail about what all those were, but back then we used to walk, chew gum, and do 8 other things at the same time, and we could handle it. It would put a lot of pressure on North Korea as to how they would handle it, but that's okay with me. So you'll notice then, stepping back, this is a strategy that says multi-lane highway, discuss everything once, then we're choreographing what we're doing in the different tracks and how far we go on different tracks at the same time? Yes. And therefore, in the initial phase, you're probably just going to be concentrating on setting up a process in which we open up dialogue on all those things. And that's good, because actually no one is really ready to do the substantive work on most of those tracks yet, including the North Koreans. I don't actually think, as a government, they've deeply made up their mind exactly what economic renewal means in practical terms, exactly what sanctions they need lifted when in order to get at that. I think take some time, get a wonderful and promising process going, and then see where that leads. Meanwhile, what's happening instead of setting up a serious cooperative process with U.S.-South Korean teamwork is ad hoc improvisations, mainly orchestrated by the South Korean government, because they've been much more competent and purposeful about this than anybody else, and in which they're now wanting a peace declaration, which is more symbolism, that doesn't then address what happens to the armistice. If we're not at war, what happens to the ceasefire agreement, which is important since it's the ceasefire agreement that actually determines the current borders in the demilitarized zone. And also, I think, is a process that threatens to lead to the informal erosion of UN Security Council sanctions without a formal agreement, which I'm not sure will end up strengthening stability, but maybe there's a theory in North and South Korea that will end up being a good thing, including for South Korea's economic relations with the world. And by the way, South Korea has a lot of economic issues of its own internally that I won't get into. To then step back from all of this and stop. This is a peninsula. For a long time, this region of Asia has been a fulcrum of peace and stability in Asia as a whole for at least 100 years, actually more than at least 150 years, I guess I could argue. You just kind of study the history of great power conflict in that part of the world for a long time. Kind of what has happened to the Korean people, and above all the South Korean people, is one of the most amazing political and economic success stories in all of modern world history. This is just an amazing country, what it has achieved from where it is, at a level that really almost no country that I can think of, maybe no country, has achieved what it has achieved. It has a fantastically energetic population, ingenious, smart, active, and enormous potential in its youth. So the positive potential here is historic, and actually it would be a good thing if this conflict could be resolved. I, for one, am not, if this conflict were resolved, I'm not worried about what that does to American hegemony. I'm not worried about American hegemony for these reasons. American hegemony America's role in the world is being contested for lots of reasons. What happens with Korea, I think, will not be the dominant variable in that equation. But for Northeast Asia's sake, and for the future of Asia, and for the future of the Korean people, it would be fantastic to actually try to solve this problem constructively. And my concern is right now there is no visible plan to do that.
About kind of gap
It's a great question, a great point. So one issue is basically, can North and South Korea solve their problems without getting outsiders involved all that much? Just sit down and work on the problems for a while. By the way, in the East European case, the fundamental variables in the East European Revolution, starting with Poland and Hungary, were their debts to Western banks because of a very deep economic relationship they had formed in the 1970s and 80s with Western capital and with the International Monetary Fund and its conditions, that then required them to adopt roundtable agreements to bring the opposition in order to impose the austerity that would allow them to get an IMF fund agreement and solve some other internal debt issues. So outsiders were really quite deeply involved in that sense in the East European revolutions and the political changes, as of course was the Soviet Union, as all of them knew, because the communist governments were looking to the Soviet Union to back their play in crushing the revolutionaries, and the Soviet Union, had they chosen to back their play, would have let them adopt what they all called at the time the Chinese solution, which they had just watched the Chinese successfully implement in Beijing. So that outsiders were involved in some of those issues going in, and then outsiders were involved in orchestrating, and by the way, what does the future look like? If you end the division of Germany, the Germans themselves thought that outsiders were absolutely indispensable to the diplomacy to make that work. But I want to come back to the point I stressed, is that when you look at the Korean problem, my argument is actually a diplomatic structure in which the Koreans are central and the Americans are stepping back, rather than trying to make the Americans central. I actually think that exaggerates the deformity that I think you're instinctively reacting to, and actually undercuts the ability of the South Koreans to play a central role in orchestrating the necessary international coalition to help their work. See, part of the problem here is the North Koreans are going to want to address somehow the UN Security Council sanctions. North Korea is more sanctioned than any other country on earth. And these sanctions are in layers, going now back at least 12 years. I was part of the diplomacy that helped put some of the first UN Security Council resolutions in place. And they're about many more things than just nuclear weapons. So you either basically blow off the UN Security Council, these unique UN Security Council sanctions, which has large international consequences, or else you unravel them, which then requires you to work with the international community to do that. Let me take one more question and then get JJ up here. Yeah.
Hello, President Zelikow. My question is, even though you talk about the role of South Korea and how the United States should support South Korea in its diplomatic mission, but you also mentioned a little bit about bringing China into this picture, because it seems that China has a strong stake in this problem, and China will get involved no matter what the United States or South Korea is doing. So I think, what should the United States do to encourage a more cooperative relationship with China on this question, or do you think this cooperation with China is really necessary?
Well, if our government was actually well organized, it would think a little bit about the consequences of its Iran decisions for its Korean diplomacy and the consequences of its China policy for its Korean diplomacy. The government at the moment has really torn up any constructive dialogue with the Chinese, I expect, about anything, at least for a while. Whatever prospects there were, whatever was going on with that a year ago is now much harder. The Chinese, of course, are deeply engaged for their own reasons. They've had now at least 3 major summit meetings with the North Korean leader, I think just in the last year, by the way, about which the world knows almost nothing. And I note these things. I ask myself what they're talking about. I wonder what it could mean, and I'm humbled. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on having to do with what economic relationships can keep North Korea afloat in the interim, what the long-term vision should be. Russia is playing a piece, by the way, in the sanctions violations now, a significant piece. So you may ask yourself, what does China's long-term strategy should envision for the future? And by the way, this is not clear. yeah, you can make an argument, the stock argument is, the Chinese just want the Americans out, and they really feel threatened by a Korean reconciliation that leaves the Americans in. I don't know about all of that, but I think that the Chinese, of course, are also watching the Japanese and trying to think about the future of South Korea. My own view, by the way, is that the surest guarantee of a friendly American partnership with South Korea that endures is the way America handles this diplomacy with South Korea now, which is one of the reasons why I'm arguing that we should take a role of trying to reinforce a South Korean-led team, which we can do very well. We don't have to be insecure about our influence on that team. But by doing that, we actually can then build the foundation for a friendly relationship with South Korea through a lot of, I think, very turbulent things that may come. Let me stop there and let's hear another voice.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yoon Jae Cho, and last speaker, thank God, you don't have to endure anymore after me. And I have the challenge of, as the last speaker, challenge of rising to the high bar that the two previous great speakers set, and also have the additional burden of keeping the audience awake. So I'll use a visual aid to keep you awake and to follow me better. Since Professor Park spoke about South Korea from South Korean perspective, and Professor Zelikow talked about the Korean problem from an American perspective, I feel compelled to speak about this problem from a North Korean perspective. But unfortunately, I'm a Korean, born and raised in South Korea. I'm not from North Korea. And I'm a naturalized American citizen, and now I work in Japan. So I can possibly speak from a South Korean perspective, maybe an American or maybe a Japanese perspective, but my view would not be a North Korean perspective. So what I present today would be characterized as a South Korean, American, Japanese perspective on North Korea. But because North Korea is such an important part of this triangle that Zelikow talked about, I think it is critical that we have some knowledge and understanding of what's going on within North Korea in order to understand the summits and discussions and the prospects of peace in the peninsula and Northeast Asia region as a whole. Now let me see if I can move the slide up. All right. I think I'm told to press this button. All right. Well, as Professor Park talked about, the Candlelight Revolution brought about some radical changes that seriously undermine what he calls the division system. What has happened within North Korea is in a way comparable to the revolution in the South, in that the changes have brought about serious challenges to the same division system. But the changes were driven mainly by concerns for economic development within North Korea. And because I wanted to come up with a catchphrase that would match the Candlelight Revolution, I coined the term LED Revolution. The buildings, the high-rises in the background of the slide are actually the new buildings in Pyongyang that are lit with LED lights. And this set of buildings, in a way, symbolizes what North Korea has accomplished under Kim Jong-un and what North Koreans would like to spread throughout their country. So there is a fundamental shift towards economy within North Korea. And it's not just a simple desire to have a better life. Of course it is, and it's an important one, but it's much more than that in the sense that its shift towards the economy involves a serious undermining of the division system. And what's really fortuitous for the Koreans and the others is that these two revolutions have occurred almost simultaneously, creating the possibility of a virtuous cycle between the two. And so the summits between the Koreas and the summit between the U.S. and North Korea, and possibly more, have been made possible by this confluence of two revolutions in the two Koreas at the same time. So I know that the Seung-won, one of the key organizers of the conference, is a physicist, and we have some engineers and scientists in the room. I myself was a former physics major, and so I put my argument in a formula that even they can understand. And so that's the, if you add candles to the LEDs, you get peace. So Seung-won, you understand this, right? That's my argument. But so far, it's a partial peace, and maybe it's just an image of peace, but we still have the remaining question of whether this process will lead to real peace. So what's going on in North Korea? There has been a major shift of a national strategy away from military to economy. So military first politics was the national strategy of former leader Kim Jong-il. And when he was in power, North Korean economy was in shambles, the whole society was in disarray, the bureaucracies did not work, the party was shaken up, Kim Jong-il did not have much to rely on. The military was the only thing that he could turn to for support and implementation of his policy. And so naturally, he turned to the military to sustain the country and to rebuild the economy. And in the process, he raised the importance of the military, and military National Defense Commission became the most powerful state organ that made all the important government decisions. So it was a prototypical military state. But his son, Kim Jong-un, the new leader, has been making steps away from that militarized state and the focus on the military toward economy. And his primary national strategy can be called economy first policy. One of the first speeches he made, he vowed that the people of North Korea would never have to tighten their belt again. And his commitment to economic development was made clear and public from the beginning. And he's been making a number of steps to implement this strategy. And what's important is that the Candlelight Revolution in South Korea made it possible for Kim Jong-un to turn to the economy. When a hardline government was in place in the South, pursuing policies to undermine North Korean government, reunification by force, or at least undermining of North Korean authority by other means, so that North Korea would be subsumed under South Korean leadership. North Korea turned to the military, and that was the surest means by which it would guarantee its survival. But the Candlelight Revolution brought in a new government that is open to diplomacy, dialogue, and cooperation. And so North Koreans are less concerned about their survival and security, and they know they can now make the shift to economy without worrying about their survival and security as much as before. And so North Koreans, of course, have this desire for better life and have had this for a long time, but it's the Candlelight Revolution in the South that actually made it possible for them to adopt this as their national strategy. And together with the change in the national priority, there have been some changes in the leadership, and changes can be characterized by the demise of the military generals and the rise of technocrats and diplomats. And so those who occupied the National Defense Commission have been demoted. And the guy who occupied most important and powerful position within the military, director of the General Political Bureau of the Korean People's Army, is Kim Soo-gil, who happened to be the chief of Pyongyang Party, Korean Workers' Party, Pyongyang District. He was chief of Pyongyang District Party, and he oversaw the construction of these buildings. He oversaw and led the rehabilitation of the capital city. He mobilized the military in order to build these buildings. And the fact that he became the top guy of the North Korean military suggests that Kim Jong-un now wants to scale up what has been accomplished in Pyongyang. So he wants to mobilize not for building more weapons and nuclear weapons, but for building high-rises and amusement parks and whatnot. Replicate what has been done in Pyongyang in the rest of the country. Likewise, technocrats and diplomats have become more prominent and given more important and powerful positions. And some examples are Choi Ryong-hae and Park Bong-ju, who now occupy the positions of Vice Chair of State Affairs Commission, which replaced National Defense Commission. The chair is Kim Jong-un, of course. And Choi Ryong-hae is a lifetime party member, party worker. And he has primarily worked on youth groups. And so the fact that he's been promoted to the most powerful position under Kim Jong-un implies that they want to mobilize the youth and activate the youth energy into rebuilding their country. Park Bong-ju is an engineer, chemical engineer for that. And he started out as an engineer at a factory. He rose through the ranks, working as a factory manager, minister of chemical industry and whatnot. And now he's one of the two top officials. Again, showing that now the focus will be economy. Another interesting change is the rise of the diplomats. And so people like Ri Yong-ho and Lee Soo-young have been promoted to the Central Committee Political Bureau, the cream of the crop, the most powerful of the power within the party. And Kim Gae-kwan, another diplomat, is now elected to the Central Committee. So it's rare to see these diplomats occupying important central key party positions, but now even two of them occupy the most important positions within the party. So it's not just these personnel changes, but policy changes that we see in North Korea. And North Korea has created 22 economic development zones. These are special economic zones, like in China, that are designed to attract foreign investment, foreign direct investment. And these are special zones that are created to work with outsiders. And Kim Jong-il tried this before, but he failed miserably. He succeeded in maintaining only 2, Kaesong and Kumgangsan. And these 2 worked only because South Korean businesses went in, South Korean tourists went in until the conservative government shut them down. But Kim Jong-un, gosh, these names are so confusing. Kim Jong-un now wants to scale up and has created 22 zones. And one of them is inside Pyongyang and given the name Gangnam, Special Economic Zone, just like a Gangnam style. And that zone was created in 2017 in the midst of nuclear testing and missile testing and so forth. Again, implying that Kim Jong-un wanted to had a longer-term strategy of opening up his economy and bringing in foreign capital and technology and work with outsiders. And interestingly, these zones were not necessarily designed by Kim Jong-un himself, but rather by economists who have been trained, who have been sent to Canada to learn how the world economy works. They were given lectures in business school at UBC, University of British Columbia, for 6 months at a time. And a number of them went there, got their training, and returned. And they weren't being taught about how communist economy works, even in Canada. They were taught how capitalism works and how to run businesses in the globalized economy. And these are the economists who returned and designed the economic development zones and designed the laws that support these zones. And on top of that, a Ministry of External Economy was established as the Ministry of Trade, Committee of Joint Venture, and Committee of National Economic Development all merged into this new ministry, again indicating the seriousness of North Korean government about working with outside businesses and governments. And another important change is decision-making authority has been devolved to the lower level, in the farms, in the factories, in the governments, and everywhere you can imagine. So North Korea has been going through a rather fundamental change in their focus and in their emphasis and in their policies, not just 2017 or 2018, this year, but this has been going on since Kim Jong-un assumed power. So it's been around for at least 10 years, if not more. And at this point, you should be asking yourself, doesn't add up, right? If Kim Jong-un was so focused on economic development since he assumed power in 2011, then why the hell is it that he tested his nuclear weapons and shot up his missiles until 2017? Why is it that he turned to diplomacy only in 2018? Makes no sense, right? Well, the answer is the Candlelight Revolution. In fact, North Korean government under Kim Jong-un made at least two important proposals for diplomacy and dialogue to solve the nuclear problem. One was made in 2016 and the other 2017, and both of them were rejected by the hardline South Korean government and the Clinton administration. Obama administration. And North Koreans' rule of behavior can be characterized by tit for tat. So they could make a proposal for talk, but if their proposal is turned down and perhaps replied with more sanctions and hardline policies, then they themselves turn to hardline policies. So as soon as their proposal for talk was turned down in 2016, they started firing missiles. As soon as their proposal for talk was turned down in 2017, North Koreans conducted another nuclear weapons test and shot up more missiles. But the Candlelight Revolution made a difference because North Koreans' opening for diplomacy and cooperation was positively reciprocated by the South Korean government. That was brought in by the Candlelight Revolution. And that is the key difference. And so this is the only theoretical argument that I as an IR scholar, would make. That is, North Korea's identity is not only internally driven, but also relationally constituted. So what North Korea does and wants to do is at least partially driven by domestic politics and domestic needs. But its actions and decisions are also affected by what others do, what South Koreans do, and what Americans do. And so far, the Candlelight Revolution made it possible for the North Koreans choose a more optimal choice between the two. So North Koreans have two choices. One is to try to develop economy while holding on to nuclear weapons. The other is trying to develop their economy while having a peaceful and cooperative relationship with the outside. And everybody can see that the former is a suboptimal solution, and the latter is a better choice. But if the latter is not possible, then North Koreans will hold on to the first suboptimal choice because they have a fundamental sense of insecurity and fundamental fear for survival. But again, Candlelight Revolution changed the structural condition under which North Korea can turn toward the second option. But I think the U.S. still remains North Korea's significant other, and what it chooses to do will have a really important impact on North Korean choices. And North Koreans have inched away from military-first politics and nuclear weapons, but has not given them up yet. That's for sure, as Zelikow so clearly reminded us. And I think what's important is to recognize that there is an opening that's been made by the Candlelight Revolution and the LED Revolution. And it's really up to the American government and the public to continue, to choose to continue that path, or help North Korea go back to the suboptimal solution. So I think we are at a critical juncture, and Americans have an important decision to make. Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again, and it's really wonderful to get this really great question. And that, is the problem and the beauty of a democracy, right? The government comes and goes, and we have a different leadership every so often, and it's the wonderful thing about democracy. But at the same time, it creates uncertainty and unpredictability, and it could reverse a positive process. And so I think the key task is institutionalization of the rapprochement that's going on right now, as you rightly pointed out. And Professor Peck also mentioned this in his address, that is institutionalizing the inter-Korean relationship in the form of association of two Koreas. 국가연합 will be a really important step that can consolidate what has been accomplished so far.
All right, we'll take a couple minutes break and reconvene.
Great, thank you.
It's good to see you.
Yeah,
again,
good
sir.
to see you. Yeah. So you've been keeping it up.
Yeah, definitely. I've been reading a lot, but I did get a little bit confused this